The Chinese Dream, a phrase that was used as a slogan in 2012 by the current president of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. The then newly elected head of the Chinese Communist Party referred to the Chinese Dream as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Xi did not coin this phrase. The origins of the Chinese Dream can be traced to ancient Chinese literature. In a poem called Flowing Spring, poet Zhang Sixiao describes waking up in despair after dreaming of the former Western Zhou dynasty. Centuries later, the two words were once again picked up, and this time they were marketed heavily by Xi Jinping. A propaganda blitz that he sold to more than 1 billion people. But 8 years later, Xi's dream seems to be falling apart. Two years into the COVID crisis, the world is still grappling with the deadly Wuhan virus. Nobody can forget these horrific scenes. Many countries, including India, were hit by a series of COVID waves. The pandemic claimed millions of lives and crippled economies, but in China, it was business as usual. From films and entertainment to record sales and online shopping, Chinese consumers began to act and spend largely as they did in pre-COVID times. As world leaders struggled to restart the global economy, China claimed it was on track to beat its gross domestic product growth target of above 6%. It was the only country profiting during the pandemic.
I think China's true nature became very clear in 2021. The world has been locked down and ill for 2 years because of China. China covered up the emergence and the extent of the coronavirus that came out of Wuhan before Chinese New Year in 2020. It could have locked down and it didn't for political and economic reasons, and the world became sick. And China was also benefiting with the sale of PPE, masks, coveralls for medical equipment, medical supplies as export products. So, it didn't do badly. And I think that people across the world and their governments finally recognise that the Chinese government lies for its own protection.
In February, a joint World Health Organization and China team that was probing the origins of COVID-19 wrapped up its inquiry, only to find nothing. The possibility that the virus had emerged accidentally from a laboratory was dismissed, deemed extremely unlikely. The investigators concluded that the coronavirus is more likely to have jumped to humans from an animal, and that bats remain a likely source. Initial reports that stated it originated from the Wuhan seafood market were also disregarded. But can this investigation, which Beijing successfully delayed for a year, be trusted?
China is not known for cooperating with the outside world when it comes to investigating internal matters inside China. So I think that we need to be necessarily skeptical that Beijing would be willing to cooperate. It is the epitome of opacity. It is not willing to be honest quite frequently when it comes to things that happen at home, and this is its position.
The world has paid a price for trusting the WHO and its ally. Soon after the findings were revealed, a dozen countries, including the US, UK, Australia, Japan, and Canada, demanded, quote, a transparent and independent analysis and evaluation free from interference and undue influence. The World Health Organization wants to relaunch investigations with a fresh team of investigators. The old one has been disbanded. As expected, China is resisting the renewed probe. It is now accusing the WHO of arrogance and disrespect for common sense. Time is running out to determine how the pandemic began. Will the world ever solve the mystery? Not if it's left up to China.
Let's see, the WHO has frequently been criticized for being too friendly to China, which suggests that the WHO, we have to worry that the WHO would not be willing to push Beijing. But we clearly are seeing a very broad consensus developing around the world for there to be a proper investigation of what happened. And hopefully that will convince all key entities, including the WHO, to really try to develop the right incentive mechanisms for Beijing to cooperate in any type of investigation on the origins of the pandemic.
The relationship between Australia and China had already turned sour in 2020, when the Australian government led the international call for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 in Wuhan. In 2021, Australia once again called for a transparent probe. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said in July, quote, "Those who have lost their lives and their livelihoods, they deserve answers. Australia will continue to ask the questions to get those answers." In return, China further decoupled economic ties with the country. It had targeted Australian imports including coal, sugar, barley, and lobsters in 2020. Beijing thought that it could punish Canberra for its defiance with economic pain, but experts say that the move has backfired.
The manipulation of the World Health Organization, the attempt to strangle the Australian economy because the government called for an independent inquiry into the source, the origin of the coronavirus. China is really pursuing through Xi Jinping quite belligerent policies, I think, towards the region. Conducted a very vigorous and nasty, surprisingly nasty campaign against any questioning of the way it dealt with the emergence of the virus. And smart people know that knew what China was up to.
But one thing that is clear is that China's image globally has turned significantly negative. Well, certainly there are more and more parliamentarians around the world and are certainly bold in criticizing China or calling out China for wrongdoing. Although we might see or read about statements that, whether it's the Australian government, the United States government, or other governments around the world, they'll make statements critical of China. They might issue sanctions, and we've seen several rounds of sanctions for officials involved in Hong Kong policy, Xinjiang policy, Tibet policy, whether from the United States or the European Union or other countries. But then we still see that these governments will meet with Chinese officials. We still see Chinese officials traveling around the world. Now, Xi Jinping hasn't left China in about 2 years, which is starting to attract more and more attention and commentary from outside of China. But we continue to see Chinese officials traveling to Europe, to the Middle East, Africa, South America. So we're not quite there yet where we're seeing global governments go all out or 100% in isolating China.
Refusing to be bullied in April, Australia canceled 2 major Belt and Road Initiative deals with China. It's not the only country boycotting Xi's ambitious 70-nation infrastructure initiative. Beijing's building spree has also run into trouble in Pakistan. The Baluchistan province is at the heart of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Its port city, Gwadar, has become the epicenter of protests. The people of Baluchistan are opposing Beijing's flagship project. They fear their livelihood will be snatched. In other countries, too, the Belt and Road Initiative is being criticized for saddling developing nations with unsustainable debt.
Two great friends of freedom.
China is increasingly finding itself being cornered. In September, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States announced a historic security pact in the Asia-Pacific. The Trilateral Security Pact is known by the acronym AUKUS. China has condemned the AUKUS Pact as being extremely irresponsible. The ties between China and Australia have reached an all-time low.
The AUKUS Treaty, which essentially is an arrangement that allows Australia to get the types of military technology that it's really sought to push back against China, that's a game changer for sure, right? It's a case of 3 major powers, the US, the UK, and Australia, working together to counter Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific. That is exactly what the US wants to do, and it clearly is what some of these other countries want to do. This is something that will concern China.
Just after the AUKUS deal was signed, the world witnessed the first ever in-person Quad Summit. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is a group of 4 countries, the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. Officially, the Quad was conceived to safeguard interests in the Indo-Pacific region. However, analysts say it was formed to counter China's military and economic aggression in recent decades.
I think that Australia is a key factor in this story about China and how the world is addressing it. We know that for a number of years, one of the reasons why the Quad was unable to gain momentum is that Australia, not India or any other country, Australia was a holdout. It was unwilling to move forward with the Quad for fear of antagonizing a country that it really valued its trade relations with. But now we've seen Australia go in a very different direction, and it's quite notable that all 4 Quad countries, Australia included, are experiencing their worst crisis in relations with China in many years.
Interesting thing there is that China doesn't really have much of an ability to match that. So they don't have military alliances with any other significant military power. Yeah, they might do joint exercises with different countries, whether it's Pakistan or some of the Central Asian countries, periodically with Russia. And of course, they buy weapons from Russia. But we don't see China involved in deals with or arrangements with what we could really call military allies or partners to the same extent.
In 2021, Beijing continued to stake its controversial claim on South China Sea. It has been building military bases on artificial islands in the area for years. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan also claim parts of the energy-rich waters. One of the world's busiest waterways, the South China Sea has become a flashpoint for tensions between China and other nations. Worryingly for China, Taiwan is trying to assert itself on the international stage. The Chinese government sees Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually be part of the country again. Tensions between the two are at their worst in 40 years.
Its attitude towards Taiwan and America's very close, legally binding relationship with Taiwan over 2022, and how Taiwan also reacts to that because of what's been happening in Hong Kong, the rollback of freedoms, human rights, freedoms of speech, the recent manipulated elections that we have seen. How does that affect? Taiwan sees Hong Kong as the writing on its own wall, and I think that it will be a very serious issue for us to look into and follow over the coming year.
But Taiwan has a lot of good news going for you. The pandemic is certainly one of them. The extraordinarily low number of COVID-19 cases and deaths that we've had here in Taiwan has attracted a lot of positive media coverage. Obviously, Taiwan's role in the technology industry has also attracted a significant amount of coverage and a significant amount of come be my friend requests.
Recent Chinese incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone have been met with international support for Taipei, including from the United States. In fact, in March 2021, John Hennessy Naland became the first sitting U.S. envoy to travel to Taiwan in an official capacity since Washington cut formal ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing in 1979. The European Union, too, sent its delegates to the island for the first time and said protecting Taiwan's democracy is a treasure to be protected.
The more we show we care about our relationship with Taiwan, the less chance you have to enter into a conflict in Beijing. And this is really the message we want to pass to our executive branches, to our member states, to everybody in Europe, is that the more you interact with Taiwan, the further you get from a war situation.
And then there was this shocking friendship. After the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan on August 15th, most countries closed down their diplomatic missions in Kabul and started evacuating their citizens out of Afghanistan. But China chose to stay put, along with Pakistan, Iran, and Russia. Most nations adopted a wait-and-see approach. China endorsed the Taliban government. It was among the first to develop diplomatic channels with the new rulers. The Chinese envoy met Taliban leaders after they seized power. In July, a month before the fall of Kabul, a Taliban delegation headed by its senior leader, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, had visited China and held talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The Taliban had declared that it sees China as a, quote, friend of Afghanistan. The question is, how will China profit from the relationship?
China, Pakistan, Iran, and Russia were certainly together in wanting the United States removed from the region, and that meant them leaving Afghanistan. China's relationship with the Taliban goes back 25 years. Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, are nothing if not opportunistic. China has its eye on Afghanistan's territory as a transit through point for the stuff that it manufactures in its industrial belt on its eastern coast to its markets in Europe. And Chinese ambassadors, successive in Afghanistan, have told me that themselves.
The Taliban had also assured Beijing that it would not host Uyghur Islamic militants from the volatile Xinjiang province, which is a major worry for the Chinese government.
China getting guarantees from the Taliban, if we continue to support you, if we move towards some sort of diplomatic recognition, financial support, will you help us deal with the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which is linked to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? And there are, as we know, 1 million Uyghurs incarcerated in the region of Xinjiang, which borders Afghanistan. And this is very sensitive for Beijing. It's also a very sensitive issue for the rest of the world. It's been called a genocide by the United States and by other countries as well.
China has been accused of committing crimes against humanity and possible genocide against its Uyghur population. Citing the ongoing genocide, the Biden administration announced a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Beijing Olympics.
Boycott Beijing! 2022! Boycott Beijing! Boycott Beijing 2022! Boycott Beijing 2022!
While athletes will still be competing, other high-profile dignitaries will not be attending the ceremonies. The United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada also said that they will not send their officials. It's a major geopolitical snub for Beijing. Meanwhile, the world continued to see high-profile people seemingly vanish into thin air in China. From Alibaba chief Jack Ma, who went missing in late November 2020, to Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai, who disappeared in November 2021, many big names were targeted for questioning Xi Jinping's government. Not just people, China's crackdown on private enterprise in 2021 knocked more than $1 trillion off the market value of some of the country's largest companies. The sweeping crackdowns have left investors reeling. This is Xi's new China.
We have to hope that we see more of what we saw in 2021. We saw an effort on the part of the U.S. to build a more organized, broader consensus to bring attention to China's actions, whether this be, surveillance, whether it be human rights violations of other types. And I think the hope is that we'll see more of that. The hope is that there'll be more efforts on the part of the global community to try to develop alternatives to what China is trying to do.
On July 1st, the country marked the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. Dressed in Mao's suit, Xi waved to the crowd from the ramparts of the Tiananmen. It was a highly symbolic scene, harking back to October 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in the square. Power-hungry Xi is positioning himself as bigger than Mao. Mao's Cultural Revolution was a catastrophe. How will things turn out for Xi's new China?